Hello and welcome to our web session, Nature Restoration, a Win-Win for Climate and Biodiversity. Thank you so much for joining us, and you'll be here for the next hour. We're here to accentuate the positive, the benefits for citizens, businesses, and the natural world of working towards restoring the fast dwindling biodiversity. I'm Rini Wyndham. I'm a former BBC journalist, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. And we have a fantastic panel of 6 highly experienced people. Esther Assine from the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, Jessica Mitlam from the European Youth Biodiversity Network, Luc Baz, who is European Regional Director in Brussels for the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Joy Keem, Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Environment Programme UNEP, Cristina Romanelli from the World Health Organization Joint Work Programme on Biodiversity and Health, and Eva Meyerhofer, who is Lead Environment and Biodiversity Specialist at the European Investment Bank. And of course, we want you, the audience, to join in. That's the most important part of our session here. So you can go to the bottom right of your screen and press the question mark, and then that will mean you can send in a question. Or if you just want to chat, you can push the Join Chat button on the left of your screen. And you also have a networking area where you can meet other people, and you can join us on social media with a hashtag EU Green Week. So what can you expect from this session? Well, first we'll be going one by one to each of our speakers. Then we'll go to the body of the session, which is your questions and lots of other questions. And finally, a summary of what we've heard this morning. So building, farming, medicine, food, they all depend on nature. A devastating amount of biodiversity is being lost across Europe and the rest of the world. And that's mainly because of intensive farming and also urban growth. And that's leading to climate change. The European Environment Agency says 80% of key habitats across Europe are in poor or bad condition. In the past 50 years, the world population has doubled, degrading biodiversity on 3/4 of our land and 2/3 of our marine environment. 2020 has been the hottest day on record, according to Copernicus. Well, 10 years ago, more than 150 countries got together in Japan for the HE biodiversity targets to prevent more species from vanishing, and they tackled everything from coral reefs to deforestation. And although nations have mainly failed to meet the HE targets, according to the UN, there is good news because over a quarter of the goals have been partially met, so there is some hope yet. Luckily, there's still time for positive change, and that's really what we're talking about today. So over to our first speaker. We'll hear from Esther Assine from the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. Esther will talk about the current commitment by the EU to restore biodiversity and degraded ecosystems. She'll consider what the EU is doing successfully and the huge amount more that still needs to be done. So over to you, Esther.
Thank you very much, Renee, and welcome to all the participants in this webinar. Very happy to be here today representing WWF. You said in the intro, Renee, that human activities have significantly altered 3/4 of the Earth's land and 2/3 of the ocean in recent decades. And we know that this has led to catastrophic loss of species and biodiversity, but it's also exacerbating, and you refer to the hottest year ever, the dangerous levels of climate change. And since 50 years, so more or less my own existence on Earth, there's been an average decline of 68% in wildlife populations. And global temperatures as well have risen by one degree of pre-industrial levels. And what we are seeing now is that we are rather on a trend to reach over 3 degrees of global warming, which would be devastating for human societies, for our economies, but also for the natural world. Furthermore, the current pandemic has brought into a sharp focus the linkages between human health and well-being and the health of our own planet. In the 2030 EU Biodiversity Strategy, the Commission announced that they will propose legally binding restoration targets to restore biodiversity and degraded ecosystems, especially those with the most potential to capture and to store carbon and to prevent and reduce the impact of natural disasters. And we in WWF, we welcome those proposals to restore nature for both biodiversity and for climate. And we are calling on the Commission to define a set number of square kilometers at EU level, but also at member state level. These targets, we believe they could really bring Europe's nature back and contribute to solving the climate crisis. But an important point is nature restoration must be on top of cutting emissions from fossil fuels, and it has not to be used as an excuse for doing less when it comes to cutting emissions. We know that if we want to stop runaway climate change, we have to do both. We have to dramatically cut in the emissions, but also we have to use more carbon removals by ecosystems. And the two cannot be interchangeable, because you have to see now the terrible effects and the forest fires that they are just putting, destroying all these natural carbon sinks. And forest fires can account for as much as 20% of the global greenhouse gas emissions per year. Unfortunately, the target that the Commission has put for 2030 when it comes to climate, it's a net reduction target. We are talking about 55% net reduction target, meaning that it includes also these carbon removals by natural sinks and ecosystems. And in practice, in real terms, what does it mean? Well, it means that actually we are just cutting around 50 or 53% in emissions, which is far below the 65 emission reduction target that the science requires. Just to conclude, we are calling on member states to back the higher target. And also we are advocating for changes in the EU biomass policy, which is actually rewarding member states for burning trees in the name of climate change. Along with these measurable restoration targets in the biodiversity strategy, these actions can help bring back and protect our precious nature, mitigate climate change, but especially bring major benefits for all in society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for chivying us all along and not letting us get complacent and saying how important we have to, at the same time, cut emissions and think about carbon removal. We can't do just one, and we've got to work pretty fast, pretty soon. Thank you so much, Esther. And next up, we have Jessica Micklem, who coordinates the European and Central Asian chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and youth section of the Convention on Biological Biodiversity. Young people are coping with so many crises at the moment. It does seem to be hitting young people more than everybody else. And throughout their lives, we don't know what it's going to be like. And biodiversity is obviously important for the future. So investing in restoring ecosystems is our top priority for the future and the future of the planet. So it'll be very good to hear what you have to say. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Renee for that lovely introduction, and thank you to WWF and UNEP for inviting me to speak. The COVID-19 pandemic is a direct result of years of environmental mismanagement and unsustainable development. The global response to this pandemic highlighted that we have failed to treat the environmental crisis as a real crisis. We rely on nature for food, water, physical, and mental health, yet we have failed dismally to live up to our biodiversity and climate ambitions for the last 30 years. We cannot be in the same position in 10 years' time, looking back at the EU Restoration Plan and the coming UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Humans are part of nature. If we invest in nature, we invest in the prosperity and health of current and future generations. The key to building back better is ambitious implementation of transformative policies across all sectors and all governance levels. And such a plan requires a larger workforce. But who is ready to step up? The youth, who are demonstrating every Friday. The youth who want meaningful, sustainable jobs. The youth who are forced to join the rural exodus into the cities. and the youth who will experience a skyrocketing unemployment rate because of the current crises. Already now, many of my peers who are passionate and trained environmentalists are forced to volunteer or to settle for unpaid internships because of the limited opportunities for nature-positive jobs. We are constantly told the youth are crucial and play a crucial role in building the future, but we are not given the space to flourish. According to the World Economic Forum, protecting and restoring nature can potentially create 395 million new jobs by 2030. We're asking you to make this potential a reality. Remember, we will be the ones living in the world of tomorrow, but that world will be shaped by the policies of today. We ask to be mentored and given the space to help build a better future. Ecosystem restoration is a win-win-win-win for our biodiversity, our climate, our health, and our youth. So let's invest in it.
So much, Jessica. That was very rebel-rousing indeed. There's probably quite a few young people in the audience who want to react, and they can go on the question mark and submit their questions. They might well have some questions to you too. And you really highlighted how we are taking from nature without giving anything back, and how youth seem to be shouldering the brunt on biodiversity and on a whole range of things at the moment. I must say it is pretty unfair, and I think you've made the point very clearly. And now we'll take an overview of the whole topic, really, the kind of solutions that could save biodiversity and mitigate climate change. Nature-based solutions, working with nature rather than against it, rather than taking from it, might seem obvious, but it seems to be easier said than done because we're not being very good at it. Our next speaker is Luc Bass, who's European Regional Director at the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in Brussels. Looking forward to what you have to say, Luc.
Thanks, René, and thanks for having me part in this opportunity session, which it really is, and especially for youth, because nature restoration is all about the future. I wanted to start with the first interesting message on the global risk landscape that has changed. And this is not from the environment community, this is coming from the World Economic Forum. And if you look at what has changed from 2010 to today, that should mean that we're all heavily investing in nature protection and restoration. The challenge is that we don't see that happen, although it's very clear that it is needed from this very slide, which is not, again, an environment point, but an economic point. We had the State of Nature report in the beginning of the week, which is still very worrying, and is another alarm bell. And it's pointed out in IUCN red lists, and this week, this Green Week, couldn't come at a better time. So we really need to see that restoration contribute to the recovery fund programs. We avoid unsustainable natural resource use and phase out harmful subsidies. We all know that, but then when you look at what's really happening this week, the discussions on the common agricultural policy in the Parliament and at the Council, there are a lot of worrying signs that would make these great strategies that exist on the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategy obsolete. So we are still hopeful, and we know that we need resources. We know that we need to include this in the recovery plans. We need great financing, and we need to do the financing for climate action and biodiversity at the same time. Make sure it's done in the right way. There is hope with the sustainable finance taxonomy that is being discussed, and where nature and biodiversity will be part of that. And of course, we will need to account for natural capital, otherwise we will not be able to do that. I just wanted to point to the nature-based solutions because we really need to look at a solutions picture here. There's a lot of talk about nature-based solutions, which is great. It's a concept that IUCN developed more than 10 years ago, and it aims at restoring nature and an increase on biodiversity, but it's also about societal challenges and human well-being. So it is much more than only looking at the nature context of it. And as the youth representative already said, we need to create these jobs. And so the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, and the biodiversity strategy all support and promote the scaling up of NBS. But there is a lot of discussion how it should happen, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. And that's why IUCN has developed this standard. It was launched in July 2020. It's a very consultative process. It was discussed with 800 experts across 100 countries. And so it's starting from a societal challenge. We need to be able to develop this solution so it can be scaled up. It has to be economically feasible, but we have to recognize it's not always a triple win. There will be some that will have to be supported in some losses in the beginning of the change and the transition. So it needs to be also a just transition. And we have to make sure, of course, that we can see that these investments are also rewarded with the return on investment. So restoring nature is an important nature-based solution, but let's not forget that what is left in Europe, we need to protect first. We cannot allow for more loss of nature, and so the restoration of nature cannot be an excuse for not protecting enough. Same goes with the climate points that were made just earlier by the others. And then finally, I will go to a slide in regard to what is a big opportunity for Europe. And you will see in red on that slide that there is at the moment in this opportunity that IUCN is providing a framework to put some pledges on restoration in exact hectares. And according to a methodology that IUCN has developed, over close to 200 million hectares have been pledged all over the world. There is not a single EU country that has come to the fore in what we call the Bond Challenge to restore 350 million hectares by 2030, sorry. To say that the binding targets that are in the biodiversity strategy are great when they will be achieved and agreed and then implemented, but that will still take some time, maybe some years. We need action now, and we hope that the EU and the member states will actually come with some concrete contributions and are joining the race to the top with the rest of the world. And I think here with a final comment on concluding, one element where we could become active with the partners in Europe is the Nature for Climate initiative, which is a global initiative that IUCN has joined. And we would love to see and join with partners to make a strong European or EU chapter on this Nature for Climate initiative. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Luc. Thank you so much. And an interesting point what you say about making sure we protect what is left, because in our rush to talk about new schemes and new biodiversity protection, we might forget that some of the existing nature is very vital to protect. And you mentioned finance, and we will be hearing more about finance with our later speaker in a moment. But first we go to our next speaker, Joy Keem. Joy is a Senior Economic Affairs Officer from the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. And Joy's going to look at public spending in the agricultural sector and how it affects nature and biodiversity. For the past 7 decades, we've veered away from natural farming methods, and we've been doing intensive farming. We've had monoculture, really almost going backwards. But changes are urgently needed. People want cheap food, but we don't want to degrade the land in the process. So Joy is going to explore how these changes will encourage a swift return to biodiversity. More from you now, Joy.
Renee, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Renee mentioned, that I would like to bring our attention to the issue of public spending in the agriculture sector and its impact on nature and biodiversity. As you know, the agriculture activities is one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, but it also has a very significant implications when it comes to climate change. According to the recent World Bank report, the scale of agriculture support that actually covers the 2/3 of countries that are producing agriculture products amounts to $600 billion. Yet only 5% of that actually supports any kind of conservation objectives, and the bulk of that goes to a production support. And the dominant part of that goes to a market price support. It's a type of subsidies that is largely perceived environmentally harmful, that actually intensifies production and the overuse of fertilizers and the pesticides. Another interesting figure to compare with is how much is going to the restoration and biodiversity and conservation from a global financial flows, and that only amounts to 78 to 91 billion US dollars. So you can see that the public spending and the global finance going to biodiversity restoration and conservation is totally lopsided with the public spending that actually has environmentally harmful. And certainly there is a need to redress this issue. And once this environmentally harmful support and subsidies can be repurposed to promote more sustainable agriculture activities and biodiversity restoration and conservation, we would actually have the kind of the future that we would like to have. So in this regard, the first step is we need to actually have a very clear understanding in terms of which agriculture subsidies and support have what specific implications and impacts on nature and climate and biodiversity. And in this regard, UNEP joined forces with UNDP and FAO, but also with the WHO and IMF to look at specifically the environmental, but also in general the human health and social implications of agriculture subsidies through a global report, which will be launched early next year. And as I mentioned, because the repurposing of this agriculture subsidy is important to promote sustainable agriculture and then food system, the report would also set out a very specific step-by-step guidance in terms of how countries can repurpose such subsidies once they actually phase out such subsidies to promote the sustainable food system and nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joy. And you were very good to draw the costs between what we're spending on rubbishing our countryside and agriculture with pesticides and fertilizers and the relatively small amount that we're putting into biodiversity conservation. And it is lopsided, in your words. That was very shrewd. I'm sure there'll be some questions about that. I hope people are we've already got some good questions coming in, I'm glad to say. Right now, so we come to our fifth speaker, and our fifth speaker is Cristina Romanelli. She works for the Environment, Climate and Health team at the World Health Organization. Cristina is also the WHO Interagency Liaison, working on the Joint Programme on Biodiversity and Health. COVID-19 has strongly underlined the links between the degradation of nature and the increases in disease and pandemics. So encouraging biodiversity could lead to a win-win situation of a much healthier world, healthier public and well-being. Cristina will show how close the link actually is. We've heard a lot about it, but how close is it really, the link between biodiversity and health? Your turn now, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Renee, for the introduction and actually for the great honor to participate in this brilliantly multi-sectoral and diverse panel to address the crucial nexus between biodiversity, climate change, and health. I can only really begin by saying that the conversation that we're having here today is really fundamental in this truly unprecedented moment in human history, which I think we can all agree has truly shown us more than any other that the fate of all our communities is very intimately linked to the natural world. So I'm going to take a very brief moment to zoom in on the intricate relationship between biodiversity, health, and ill health or disease. So as I was saying, I think we can very safely say that no single event in modern history is more illustrative of the intimate connections between people, other living beings, and the ecosystems that basically nurture and sustain all life on Earth. It's very well established and increasingly well known that biodiversity and healthy ecosystems are really the ultimate foundation of human health, and that many of the underlying drivers of disease emergence cut across a large range of human practices that are both destructive to nature and wildlife and can amplify disease risk in people. Several of which, actually, the speakers before me have already mentioned, including large-scale deforestation for livestock and agriculture development, resource extraction, uncontrolled infrastructure development, urbanization, the way we produce, trade, and regulate both domesticated and wild species used as food and medicine, our current global health crisis, and actually so many others that have actually preceded it, such as the Ebola crisis outbreak in 2014, for instance, have really made clear that these leading drivers of biodiversity loss, together with other environmental, social, and economic determinants of health and human behaviors, really do drive the potential for diseases to emerge and spread. So if we had to look at the scientific evidence, as we should, I think we could clearly state that it's certainly not lacking in examples of how these drivers are associated with an increase in the risk of infectious disease outbreaks. Just to name a few recent ones, we have Ebola, as I mentioned before, MERS, SARS, avian influenza, H1N1, and the list goes on and on. And ultimately, if we had to boil that down to one overarching cause, it's that our generalized mismanagement of the natural world has essentially created the conditions for emerging diseases like these and many others to emerge and spread. But both biodiversity loss and climate change are also at the heart of many non-communicable diseases, which are worth mentioning, as they are also leading causes of morbidity and mortality globally. Just to give two examples in this case, let's bear in mind that 7 million people, no less than 7 million, die every single year as a result of air pollution. And based on recent studies on the global burden of disease, an estimated 11 million premature adult deaths could be attributed to unhealthy diets, which again brings us back to this dysfunctional food system that we have created. So overall, if we try to look at the overall picture of what this represents, we know that approximately 1/4 of the global burden of disease can be attributed to avoidable environmental factors. Let's take a moment to really let that sink in. 1 in every 4 deaths is attributable to avoidable environmental factors. So, against that backdrop, the destruction of I think it makes it clear that the destruction of nature really compromises nature's ability to provide essential ecosystem services and clearly has serious consequences for human health. But it also has some, as we've all seen and we all know, it also has significant implications for economies, for livelihoods, for psychological and cultural well-being, and for human security. In addition to that, the greatest consequences are really borne by the poor and vulnerable populations, by indigenous communities, millions of which are most directly dependent on nature for their health, for their food, medicines, shelter, and livelihoods. So when epidemics such as these emerge, these vulnerable communities are also more prone to suffering multiple health burdens, both communicable or infectious and non-communicable, while at the same time having less immediate access to healthcare. So in a nutshell, while the links are absolutely clear and the stakes are very high, and the time to act is not just now, it's long overdue, as is this dialogue. So hopefully in the course of the discussion, in the course of the questions and comments made by my fellow panelists, we can really help to catalyze a movement to protect both people and nature. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. That was very enlightening. And it's funny when you spell it out that clearly, 7 million dying of air pollution, 11 million dying of unhealthy diets. It's all so crystal clear. And yet somehow we're bound into the central system of the way we're living and the way we're ruining our planet and the way biodiversity is dying. And people are just standing there knowing it's happening. And yet there's too much inaction. So that's what today is all about to really galvanize us into more action and to know that there's a lot that still can be done to make things a huge amount better. But it's all very well having these positive ideas about improving biodiversity and saving the planet, but the elephant in the room, where is the money going to come from? It'll certainly need large public and private investment at national and European level, and a pledge that EU funding will support biodiversity-friendly investments. So, down to practical details from the European Investment Bank, the EIB. Our final speaker for this session is Eva Meyerhofer, Lead Environment and Biodiversity Specialist at the EIB. The floor is yours, and give us the money, Eva.
Thank you, Renee. And it's going to be a very tall order to come after all these fantastic speakers. And I think they've touched really on some critical issues. And I'd like to refer back to what Luke mentioned, is also there's a big dimension of protect, also in terms of financing. So it is difficult, excuse me, to shift the amount of capital needed towards restoration and the protection of biodiversity. As we see, a lot of it are going to sectors that are probably more impacting adversely on biodiversity and on nature. But there is a growing number of investors, financial institutions that are starting to understand the value that nature provides to our economies and are actively investing in these areas. So there's a good momentum currently on the market. But that said, we are, of course, still facing a significant funding gap. The actors in the market, whether they are credit rating agencies, exchanges, supervisory authorities, issuers, investors, all together need to partner up to find a way, one, to add value, but after that, to share the value so that people are incentivized to keep allocating or investing in projects contributing to nature restoration. There are two main approaches to financing the protection of biodiversity and nature restoration. One is financing green. This is the whole mantra of the Sustainable Finance Regulation, the EU taxonomy. This means that financing of projects will contribute substantially to the conservation, restoration, sustainable use of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I do underline the word substantially. Financing restoration is still in the early stages of development, but the momentum is gaining, and there are some key financial instruments and approaches that are being tested and have the potential to be scaled up. And I'll get to that on my next slide. Then there's the other side of financing, which is greening the finance sector. And this is what Luke mentioned, which refers to protect. The financial materiality of biodiversity loss is becoming increasingly clear to the real sector, to projects, to companies, in which financial institutions like the EIB invest in. So there's a new generation of investors that are also more aware of environmental, social, and governance issues and are seeking to align their investments with these values. One of the excuses that is given by the financial sector or by companies alike is that there's no regulation and they will not be able to do anything without regulation. Regulation is the driving force. But in fact, the financial sector does not have to wait for regulation and can continue to develop its own standards and good practices for incorporating biodiversity risk into their investment decisions. This, in turn, will actually drive regulation as it has a knock-on effect on the market. Some are adapting, some investors are adapting quicker, and we have seen institutions divesting from harmful biodiversity projects. Central banks are coming out and are saying they will no longer own certain assets and are even considering setting targets for net zero impact on biodiversity. So financing green and green finance go hand in hand, and we need to pull every lever we have to finance nature. And capital markets can help along by providing the right incentives. Here you see a slide where you have different types of financing approaches for different types of asset classes. Now, new tools and blending approaches are being used extensively to mobilize finance for the Sustainable Development Goals, and many of these could similarly be applied to biodiversity. Private institutions will invest alongside public finance institutions and philanthropic organizations, where the main attraction is to de-risk the investment, and that de-risking is provided by the public or the philanthropic capital. However, what we are seeing today is that larger investors prefer the bond market because these different types of products are generally small scale and refer mostly to local smaller projects. So aggregation is key. So green bonds remain at the moment the single most popular asset class for institutions seeking sustainable investments. There's a growing appetite from our larger mainstream investors for investments that protect or enhance biodiversity. However, the asset classes focus currently mostly on agriculture, forestry, and to some extent water. Very few mention biodiversity. And this reflects the difficulty of measuring impact, the lack of metrics, and the fact that there is a lack of generating returns from biodiversity, and certainly a lack of robust methods to track these investments. So we hope that with the Dasgupta review, the EU taxonomy, all these will incentivize investors to start investing in restoration and biodiversity. And in addition, we will need transparent reporting assurance also to avoid all this greenwashing and give the market clearer visibility about which investments actually do support nature-based projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Eva. Food for thought there. It seems that people are starting to think more ethically about investments. Interesting that you mentioned financing green projects, but also greening the whole financial situation, not financing projects that aren't green, but being ethical, and of course green bonds as well. And money, of course, is key to all of this. So now I'm going to take some questions. We've already had a wonderful selection of questions from the floor, and I'm going first to Catherine Houchier. And Catherine really makes a point about mentoring and how you could, I can only support your demand, she says, but this is one for Jessica, by the way. I can only support your demands. However, I'd like to know how you imagine a solid, reasonable and helpful mentoring system, as you implied, especially who could do the mentoring, what platforms could be used, what actions are necessary to start such an initiative. So Jessica, you can answer this one.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Katarina, for that awesome question. I have so many ideas, but I'll just name a couple. There are many really good systems already out there, and if these become widely adopted and are just fine-tuned a little bit, we already have things that can be implemented like immediately. For example, we have the UN Youth Delegate Program. What we need is this program to be adopted by all the countries, especially in our region, to be able to get youth to international decision-making conferences like the CBD. And we need to make sure that these youth are really representative of the youth and not just token youth or cherry-picked youth. We need to make sure that when the youth get into a delegation, that they are really mentored, that they are really trained in how the system works, and that they don't come out of there completely confused and haven't been given a chance to actually contribute. And they want to contribute, they are eager to learn, and they have lots of great ideas. And I think that really needs to be harnessed. Secondly, we also need more easily accessible small funding grants that allows payment for human resources. Many young people are spending their evenings, their weekends, any time in between studies on top of a second job just to be able to fight for biodiversity. And, you know, this needs to be paid for a little bit because we also have rent to pay. We also have food bills. And then lastly, any youth that are included, just once again, not token youth and not cherry picking. We need real representation. And the last thing is that As you might have heard, the UN Parliament voted for a resolution to end unpaid internships. Unpaid in the EU. Unpaid internships are a real bane for young people, because it means that when these internships come up, only those who already have a financial backing from parents or from financial institutions or loans in order to be able to get these positions. And many who don't have this, they then need to volunteer or get experience another way and end up spending sometimes over 10 years just to get an entry-level job in the position. What happens is that institutions and organizations then end up giving the jobs and the entry-level positions to young people who usually come from a specific background and a specific area of society and not from a diverse range. And so those organizations are then limited by the perspectives in that organization. So if we have paid internships that are available to people without previous experience, we can have a diversity of perspectives and be much more resilient as institutions, as societies. And that is something really positive. So Given Europe would like to challenge everybody listening, everybody on this panel, please pay your interns a reasonable wage and make sure that entry-level jobs don't come with the requirement of 5 years of work experience. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jessica. I have noticed that an awful lot in the conservation world is done by volunteers, and it shouldn't be. It should be centre stage, and it should be properly financed, and young people coming in should be financed right from the start. Thanks very much for your answer. The next question, when I ask it, I will ask for very brief answers so we can get more questions in. Elizabeth van der Moos says, what are the key actions required to challenge our current trajectory for the degradation of biodiversity? Because at the moment, transformational change should happen, but what does it look like, and what are our chances? Will it occur during the economic, within the current economic growth forecast system? How optimistic are you? I shall go to Luke for this one.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, it's a really good one. I think there's two elements here. So we are not seeing a scaling up of investment, neither in protection or in restoration. It's all piecemeal. It's marginal. We have to be honest. And meanwhile, we're still destroying at a rapid pace outside of Europe and in Europe. And we are funding and having harmful subsidies all over the place. And we see it happening just now. I just heard about the vote in the European Parliament, which is very worrying. So that's the reality check. Now, when and to whom do we listen? It is we, but I think even more the decision makers. They do listen very carefully to business leaders. And we saw that with the energy and climate debate, and we saw some positive movement and scaling up on energy and climate efforts. And I think we will need a similar movement from business and sometimes unusual suspects to speak up about how we should improve land use, which is ultimately where the biggest threat at the terrestrial level is on nature and biodiversity. So that is one thing. And the second thing is the challenge, and it's a little bit another question that was asked on the blue and green economy. We need a proper framework for these investments. And on the one hand, we talked about this standard of nature-based solutions. So we need to know what we're talking about and have a common language. That's one thing. And the second thing is, if you do not offer a framework for return on investment, then the investments will not happen. So we need to go away from the academic discussion on natural capital accounting to some first steps in which we really do it. Even if it's not perfect, we start doing it and we make some safeguards so we don't do anything wrong, as has happened with some climate action in the nature space before. So there is a lot of opportunity. We just need political will and agreement of common language and business leaders to speak up.
Very much for your answer, Bas. That's great. And our next question is for Esther from Martin Lena, and it says it would be interesting to hear the view of WWF's representative, which is you, Esther, on the rights of indigenous people and local communities, given the recent investigations on human rights violations in the name of conservation. Very interesting question. Over to you, Esther.
Thanks, Renee. And indeed, I think some of you might know that there's been reports published last year on allegations of human rights abuses, very serious ones, committed by eco-guards with whom we collaborate in different conservation programs. And we've taken a very firm action. I don't think that that's the focus of the discussion today, but it's worth sharing that we set up an independent panel who is looking and reviewing these allegations as we speak, and also assessing the relevance and the strength of our response and internal systems. The point that I want to make is that for WWF, there's no, I mean, human rights and conservation go hand in hand. Local communities, indigenous peoples are central to the work that we do in many parts of the world, and no human rights abuses can be tolerated in the name of conservation of any other cause. I think this is what I can say so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. And now a question for Eva, I think, that about lack of funding. Somebody jumped on this and said that I said it was the elephant in the room, but they suggest that the main issue is overpopulation and also more and more middle-class people. How is this factor taken into consideration in nature restoration and in funding, Eva?
A difficult one to answer, really. I think one important aspect which also underlined is that we need to factor into our financing the environmental externalities, whether, and I think Christina addressed it, in terms of pollution, in terms of biodiversity, nature. And the moment you factor in these externalities into your economic assessment, you will be able to understand the trade-offs. And by understanding the trade-offs, you will be able to make an informed decision. At the moment, as I think Luke rightly said, is that we are trying to guide financing towards nature restoration projects and, let's say, looking at the positive agenda, yet we are still continuing destroying the environment. And it just doesn't work. So it is something that if we don't start factoring really these externalities in, we won't understand those trade-offs. Whether overpopulation is a driver, yes. Middle class, actually, the middle class is being reduced currently because of the economic crisis. So, and it's very disparate, right? I mean, you'd have to look at the different regions. But if we are looking at the EU, it is actually our consumer behavior. And if we don't have a fundamental systems change and a different mindset to sustainable development, really, we won't be getting there in the end.
Thank you very much indeed. And obviously we're all singing from the same hymn sheet and the message is very clear, but in order to persuade the general public, the governments of the world and so on, really you need a tipping point. You need a point at which people are so aware. I mean, how many forest fires will it take? How many crises will it take? Anyway, at least we're making some of a start, and we've had so many points raised that I'm now going to call on each of our panel in turn to do a quick summary of what they think are top priorities in order to restore the natural world, biodiversity, and have a healthier planet for all of us. I'll go first to Esther, sorry.
Thanks, Renee. Well, that's that's a challenging one. Of course, as we were saying, if I can pick up three, restore nature, of course, but cutting dramatically emissions. And the third is tackling the drivers as well, tackling the way we consume and produce food. And that includes, of course, agriculture and the devastating votes that we are seeing today, but also, as I said, tackling deforestation and our global footprint, what our consumption is driving in other countries. These three too: restoration, climate action, and tackling the drivers.
Thank you very much, Esther. I know we're consuming about 1.5 to 2 planets at the moment for our one planet. Next one is Jessica, please.
Thank you for the question. I think it is getting everybody involved, all sectors, all government levels. If you tell people, do you want to do something good for nature? They say yes. And our economy and our politics should reflect that. And yes, so I would say stop relying on environmental ministers or just the youth to fix the current crises. We need absolutely everybody on board. We need full cooperation from everyone. We need intergenerational efforts to be able to solve this crisis. So I think if we can restructure how we do things and reframe it, that everybody realizes they have to act now, that would be amazing.
Very much, Jessica. Quite right. There's far too much division of generation at the moment. We should all be singing from the same hymn sheet in order to improve our planet. Thank you. And now to Luke, please.
Yes, I just wanted to come back to this important link between climate efforts and biodiversity action, and also both the threats to climate and to biodiversity at the same time. Nature-based solutions are addressing both if they're done well. I think we need to continue to do that. The environmental debate has still been very split, and we hope that we will see this connection much better. Thinking of climate action again, because we were also going to talk about climate action and nature. When you do a nature-based solution, or when you restore nature or protect nature, you have a double whammy, as they say. You mitigate and you adapt at the same time. This is why it's strange that it's not in every national action plan yet. It's not in every national determined contribution to the UNFCCC or to the Paris Agreement. Yes, these actions need to be additional when it comes to mitigation. Obviously, it cannot be an excuse for less action in the hard energy sectors. We need to see this integrated in risk management of climate and energy plans even. And we need to be aware, and very much aware, that wrong climate action and wrong climate policies can still and have already resulted in biodiversity loss. So that is really a very important message. And then finally, a plea to the Green Deal and to get the Green Deal right. Again, the standard could really help achieve equitable and transition in the Green Deal. It has a very strong social component. I think we need to keep that social component very much in front of us. The whole environmental challenge and the solution to it is also and very much and very importantly guided by how we redistribute wealth, because we can only consume so much, and at some point the ones that are consuming too much will have to really reduce and to give everybody a fair share.
Thank you, Luke. You've touched on a very important point indeed about the redistribution of wealth. That is true in European countries. It's true comparing Europe to other parts of the world. And that would be fundamental to restoring biodiversity and having a key. I mean, if you've got no money, that may not be a high priority, but it has to be, because the wealth will come back in a different way. Thank you, Luke. And now over to you, Joy.
Thank you, Renee. From my side, I would say that we should stop using public funding and then government expenditures that actually hurts nature and biodiversity. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the agriculture support must stop. We need to be able to distinguish the government subsidies that are harmful for nature and biodiversity, and to redirect those to promote the other agriculturally sustainable agriculture activities and food system. And there are also other type of subsidies that are also supporting the building the capacity of agriculture sector, such as providing subsidies for clean technology innovations and infrastructure. So it is really about how you can discern those supports that are environmentally harmful and then those supports that are not harmful for nature and biodiversity, and then reform such government support and subsidies that are environmentally harmful. And also, this is even more pertinent in the context of the COVID-19 recovery, because the debt to GDP ratio is skyrocketing in almost every countries, and this is really a time for countries to use their government expenditures in a smart way that is more aligned with the sustainability and achieving a sustainable development goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. You brought up a very good point there, because somehow countries have managed to find during the pandemic money that seemed to be unavailable previously. So we ask ourselves, I wish this money had been more available for green projects and for biodiversity, but there must be money somewhere, although we're going to be slightly lacking now because of all the expenditure since COVID. Thank you very much, Joy. And now we go to Christina and the health aspect.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant question that really is. And I don't think that there's any single simple answer to that question. However, there are certainly a lot of opportunities that we can harness for healthy, green, and just recovery from the current pandemic. So I would say that first I'll give an overarching example, and that would be to really invest in holistic, whole of government, whole of society approaches, such as One Health. So One Health, for instance, brings together the health of people, the health of animals, and the health of ecosystems upon which we all collectively rely for our health and well-being. So these integrated, interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral approaches are absolutely essential moving forward. That being said, at WHO, we've also put forward some very tangible, very concrete prescriptions for a healthy, clean, green, and just economic recovery. So this can actually be broken down into 6 essential prescriptions. And they are essential, and they all mutually speak to each other, because none of them can really be examined in isolation. So I'm really looking forward to sharing these with you, brief as it may be. The very first of which links directly to the discussion that we're having here today. It's about protection. It's about ecosystem restoration and protecting and preserving the source of human health. The second of them is really tackling and investing in essential services, from water and sanitation to clean energy and healthcare facilities. Also looking at quick, healthy energy transitions, and tackling how we tackling and promoting healthy and sustainable food systems, really moving beyond the dysfunctional food system that we have created. Fifth, building healthy and livable cities. Urban health is critically important moving forward, and should definitely be considered as a priority in upcoming investment plans for a healthy recovery. And finally, stop using taxpayers' money to fund pollution. It simply does not work, and has largely created the conditions that have gotten us here in the first place. So we can choose to do things differently for our future, or work on.
Thank you very much indeed, Christina. I'm sorry to cut you off there. A very quick word from Eva. We're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Quickly, I'll just keep to one point. GDP is an outdated indicator for economic growth, and until we internalize the impact on biodiversity and ecosystems into an appropriate indicator to measure economic growth, then we will be on the right path. So you need that transformational change, and not use GDP as the sole indicator for sustainable economic growth.
Very much, Eva. Thanks all of you for sticking to time. Loads and loads of thoughts there, and a lot of inspiration for you to follow with nature-based solutions, which we'll carry on in the rest of the conference. And over the coming decade, in line with the EU biodiversity strategy, we must protect nature to tackle climate change, as you've heard. And if we do, there'll be all sorts of bonuses. There'll be better air quality, better seas, flowing rivers, healthier eating, and a healthier planet, and a healthier load of people. Will be a much, much happier situation than we are now. But for now, thanks so much to our speakers, Esther, Jessica, Luke, Joy, Christina and Eva, especially to you, the audience, for all the questions you submitted. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. To the technicians, especially Estelle, and also to Edel, who is not only the back moderator, but has coordinated this session very beautifully. And at 2 o'clock European time, you'll be able to choose from 3 sessions on ecosystems, the oceans, or unlocking finance. But for now, on behalf of the Directorate General of the Environment of the European Commission, thanks for being with us. It's been a great session. And from all the team and myself, goodbye.